Hello and welcome to the final day of the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit. I hope you've had a chance to enjoy the last few days of learning actionable tips, trends, and best practices to achieve true quality for your medical devices and business. This session is on lessons learned from the race to supply the market with respirators, masks, and other PPE. I'm Jessica Lyons, Senior Medical Device Guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I'll be your moderator for this special session. I know our speakers Todd Hillam and Thor Rollins are really looking forward to sharing their experiences and learnings that developed while supplying the market with critical devices and PPE during this crisis. The goal of the discussion is to provide you insights into how you can apply this learning going forward to make our industry stronger. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speakers and their company, Nelson Labs, I'm going to touch on a few items really quickly. First, this session is going to run for about 45 minutes in total, and will include a question and answer session at the end where Todd and Thor have been kind enough to agree to answer your questions. I encourage you guys to submit those questions throughout the presentations as they come up in the box on the right-hand side. We'll get to as many as we can. If not, don't worry, Todd and Thor will follow up with you guys afterwards. This entire session will be recorded as well. Once the session wraps up, there's a 10-minute break before the next live session begins. If you're interested in attending practical insights into managing and leading medical device companies and teams during the pandemic, make sure you're registered for the next session and use your unique link to tune in. If you aren't already signed up, you can register at virtual-summit.greenlight.guru. As far as Greenlight Guru goes, I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight and why we put on this free virtual summit. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you at today's summit. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting free events and training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based, general-purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give you a proper introduction to today's speakers. Todd Hillam has 18 years of experience at Nelson Labs, with 12 managing the protective barriers section that performs testing on surgical masks, respirators, gowns, drapes, breathing system filters, and other types of filtration products. The primary focus of testing is viable and non-viable aerosol and liquid barrier testing, as well as physical tests such as breathability, flammability, and particle shedding. He started as a study director over accelerated aging for packaging and bacteriostasis, fungistasis testing to validate the product sterility test, and then was the lab manager over the protective barrier section. Upon leaving the section, Todd worked as a product manager in marketing, senior technical trainer in Nelson's professional development department, and currently acts as a senior scientist focusing on operations training across all Nelson Lab facilities. Todd is an active committee member of both AAMI and ASTM. Todd served as ASTM F23.40 secretary for 7 years, has been a member of working groups, and has helped to revise standards related to surgical face masks and surgical gowns. Todd was invited to help revise the EN 14683 face mask standard and has given a number of seminars on protective barriers and medical textiles for industry and healthcare professionals. He's joined by Thor Rollins, a certified microbiologist who specializes in the selection and conduct of in vitro and in vivo biocompatibility tests. He actively speaks on biocompatibility related topics through Nelson Labs, external seminars, webinars, and trade shows. He presented on biocompatibility at the American College of Toxicology annual meeting in 2013 and has many published articles on biocompatibility topics. He is a participating member on all Association for Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, TC 194 and 10993 ISO committees, and plays an active role along with the FDA and regulatory committees, developing standards, discussing biocompatibility methods, and voting on changes to those standards. As one of a select group of experts in the industry, Thor's participation on the committees offers him insight into industry changes and helps prepare clients for changes in testing. So, without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenters, Todd and Thor.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone for joining us today in this webinar. We don't have a whole lot of time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. On the screen right now is just an agenda of what we're going to try to cover today during our 45 minutes. So we're going to kind of talk about the pandemic, the timelines involved, with that, the FDA emergency order and what that kind of entails. And then Todd's going to talk about the differences between ASTM testing and NIOSH testing and EN testing for masks, and what those tests kind of look like, what they look for, and what the acceptance criteria is. And then I'll be talking a little bit about what's different with biocompatibility of masks during the emergency order from the FDA compared to post. And then we'll just spend a couple minutes talking about where do we go from here? Like what's the future of protective equipment look like, at least to us when we've been seeing the increase in testing from the world right now. So here's a quick timeline of the pandemic, and I also want to mention that one of the reasons why we are in a unique position to talk about this is because the testing involved in validating these masks, either to NIOSH or ASTM methods, is kind of a niche role historically. And so there's not a whole lot of labs in the world that can offer the breadth of testing that's needed to look at NIOSH or ASTM. Nelson Labs just happens to be one of those labs. And the demand, it didn't really qualify for the a vast number of labs to do this test until recently. And so we've seen a huge amount of testing, and with that, or demand of tests. So with that, we have a kind of a unique perspective on the current situation we're in. So as you can see, the timeline of the pandemic, we start looking at things that impact the testing. Obviously, the beginning of when we start noticing the virus, to when it entered the United States, the first confirmed case in January 20th of 2020. And then that emergency use authorization the FDA issued on the 4th of February 2020. And then we started seeing some deaths and the national emergency, and then the United States basically took over as the world leader in confirmed cases. So this pandemic pretty much rolled out quickly, and with that meant that the current supply of personal protective equipment wasn't sufficient to meet the demand, just not from hospitals and nursing homes and labs like us, but also from day-to-day use of people just in their homes and in their workplace. So with that, there's been a huge increase in people trying to supply the world with really well-meaning intent to supply the world with protective personal equipment like masks. With that, the big impact to the industry, especially here in the United States, was this FDA's emergency use authorization. And here's the link. Like I said, these slides are available. If you happen to not have read this authorization before, it basically includes guidance for personal protective equipment, in vitro diagnostic equipment, and ventilators, and along with some other unique medical devices. The gist of this emergency use authorization, though, was to allow these specific types of medical devices to be used without an FDA approval. Now, there is a little bit of confusion there, where some of our companies that are maybe not have a good history in the medical device field, when they're looking at these masks, they think, okay, so the FDA now allows me to sell these masks to hospitals or to general public, and I don't have to worry about approval or going through like a 510K process. Therefore, now my mask can be sold and on the market and is safe, and FDA's approved it. These are not FDA approved products. So as soon as this emergency use authorization is pulled from use or expires, then at that point, these masks have to be pulled out of a medical device arena, a market, if they do not have a 510K number. So a lot of the things we'll be talking about today, mask manufacturers are looking to go ahead and validate or qualify their masks to be able to sell them to people, saying, hey, these masks function like an N95 or like an ASTM level mask. And then also looking to get approval to the FDA even while they're selling it. So when this emergency use authorization is done, they still have the ability to sell that mask out in the market. Now, there is a difference, obviously, between masks that are considered medical devices and masks that are used to go to a grocery store. Obviously, there's some crossover there and some things that you can look for as general public to help market the mask as more efficient or better at certain tasks, and that's what we'll talk about. But there is a difference between a medical device mask and a cloth mask that my mom sews in her basement and uses. So we'll be talking a little bit about those and what the differences are. So at this time, I'm going to turn the time over to Todd to kind of get into the actual face mask testing itself.
Okay, thanks, Thor. All right, like Thor mentioned, we see a lot of products. If you go out into the world, to the supermarket, people are wearing everything from a bandana to maybe just pulling their shirt up over their mouth and nose to an actual face mask or respirator. So with this emergency use authorization, these are some of the definitions that the FDA has put out there. So, face mask basically is something that covers the user's nose and mouth. It may or may not provide liquid barrier protection or filtration efficiency levels. A surgical mask is that mask that is FDA regulated. Prior to this emergency use and following the emergency use will be the continued regulated and approved masks for healthcare facilities. Again, it's the same definition of a face mask, covers the user's nose and face, but it provides a physical barrier to fluids, to particulates, and also has to meet other types of protection for safety with like flammability and other barrier protection. Now, how is that different from a respirator? So a respirator, most respirators here in the US are N95, meaning that they can filter out greater than 95% of the particulates that come in contact with it. They follow the 42 CFR Part 84 standard regulation. NIOSH is a government agency here in the US that approves and certifies N95 respirators. These respirators will be regulated by FDA once they are considered a medical device. So, so what is a medical device? In the emergency use authorization, the FDA says that a face mask or respirator are regulated by the FDA when they meet the definition of a device under Section 201H of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So generally, the face mask will fall within this definition when they are intended for a medical purpose. So they further define, okay, how do we define what that medical purpose of that face mask or respirator is? So a lot of it comes down to labeling. How is this mask or respirator labeled? They say that they define labeling as if it is labeled or otherwise intended for use by a healthcare professional, if it is labeled for use in a healthcare facility or environment, or if that face mask or respirator includes any drugs, biologics, or any antimicrobial or antiviral agents on that, then it would be considered a medical device and would fall under FDA regulation. A lot of these devices that don't meet those criteria are not designed to be used in a healthcare facility, can be used for the general public and don't need to go through that FDA regulation requirements. So if we look at face masks versus respirators, here's a quick picture showing the difference. Most face masks are pleated face masks, as you can see on that left side. You'll notice that it's very loose fitting to the face. Along the cheeks and along the chin area, there are gaps. As you breathe, that airflow is going to follow the path of least resistance. So if there are gaps, a lot of that airflow as you breathe in is going to go into those gaps. The face mask is designed to protect the environment, not necessarily to protect the wearer from small particulates. So it is designed to protect the environment from coughing, sneezing, talking, or as opposed to the respirator on the right side, it's a lot tighter fit to the face. Respirators are required to have fit testing to show that there aren't gaps, that as you breathe, the air has to flow through the material of that respirator. As well as you can see on the left, the face mask has ear loops. So a lot of those face masks just loop around the ear, which again aid in that loose fit. Whereas a respirator is required, by NIOSH, is required to have 2 fasteners. One that goes up over the ear and the head, and the other goes below the ear around the neck, and that helps with that tight fit. Here are some of the testing requirements when it comes to surgical face masks compared to respirators. I have some pictures on there as well for face masks. Again, that face mask that's kind of pleated, it lays flat, and as you open it up, it kind of forms around the face with a nose, a metal part for the nose to kind of help fit it to the face a little better. Whereas the respirators a lot of times are a formed mask, also with that metal form around the nose to help it fit tighter. Some respirators have a valve, as you've seen on the bottom right. That valve is an exhalation valve to aid in, as you exhale and breathe out, that valve opens up, allows that air to leave the mask, and then it closes as you breathe in, so that the inhalation has to go through the actual filter material. For surgical face masks and respirators, a lot of it depends on, the requirements depend on location, country, as well as, the device itself. So for surgical face masks, you can see there, I've listed 2 different consensus standards. One is ASTM F2100, and the other is EN 14683. So ASTM is recognized by FDA here in the United States, and EN is what you see in Europe. There are a few differences in the required tests, and I'll discuss those a little bit more in depth as we go through the presentation today. As opposed to respirators, also there are quite a few differences in the requirements for respirators as opposed to a surgical face mask. There is some differences in respirators. Normal, just N95 respirator, whether it's used in a healthcare facility or in construction or other high particulate environments, would go through NIOSH, mainly doing just filtration, breathability, and if there's a valve present, check that valve, and then fit testing. There is an option for marketing as a surgical respirator. It would still require you to perform the NIOSH N95 testing listed above, but the surgical part now will bring in fluid penetration. Can that respirator withstand the synthetic blood or that fluid penetration aspect, as well as being tested for flammability and biocompatibility? I'm going to move on and talk a little bit more in depth about the testing now. For respirators, the filtration efficiency testing follows 42 CFR Part 84. We use sodium chloride as the particulate rating, and for oil ratings, we use a diactyl phthalate challenge. We do test the entire respirator. As you see in the picture, the entire respirator is mounted to a plate, to a test plate, and placed into the test apparatus. The particles that are being challenged to the device are neutralized, meaning that the normal charge that is on that particulate are being taken off. And that reduces the ability of the mask to use electrostatic filtration aspects, which would aid in the filtration. So really what this test is looking at is the actual impact filtration of the respirator. The flow of the air going through the respirator is 85 liters per minute, and the mean particle size of the sodium chloride or the diactyl phthalate is 0.3 microns in size. And then you can see that the different types of ratings you can make. CDC does recommend at least an N95 respirator whenever there is some kind of an outbreak, a flu outbreak, or in this case with the coronavirus. They recommend, if you are trying to protect yourself from being contaminated, to use at least an N95 respirator, because it does fit around the face tightly, and it's shown through this testing and certification that it can protect you. Nelson Labs does not certify respirators. We do what's called a pre-certification. All respirators that go through NIOSH for certification require a third-party lab to do a pre-certification to show that the device can meet these criteria before NIOSH will certify them. So after filtration efficiency, we're going to look at the breathability, and it's called inhalation, exhalation. Again, we test the full device. We mount it to that plate. We pull an 85 liter per minute airflow through. On one side of the mask, we provide the air, and the other side we have a manometer testing the resistance of the air going through that mask. We test both directions, inhalation and exhalation. So one side we have pressurized air going in, and we measure the resistance. And on the other side we pull a vacuum, so we can test both inhalation and exhalation. You'll see the requirements there is less than 35 millimeters of water column for inhalation and less than 25 millimeters of water column for the exhalation. If the respirator does have a valve, an exhalation valve, we test that valve by cutting it out, removing it from the respirator, mounting it in this test mount here, sealing it up with a beeswax to reduce any leakage, and then we try to push air through the exhalation valve. Again, as you breathe in or inhale air, that exhalation valve should seal and not allow air to come through it. So that's what we're testing. If any of these valves allow 30 milliliters per minute of air, it will fail the test. So it must seal and keep air from coming in through that exhalation valve. All right, now we're going to go into face mask testing. A quick overview of this test, or the requirements of this test, and then I'll point out the differences between what's required by ASTM and what is required by the European EN standard. This bacterial filtration efficiency, or BFE test, which we call it, follows ASTM F2101 and also the European EN 14683. It is harmonized between the two standards, so the testing is the same, no matter which standard you're trying to follow. But we're trying to measure the filtration efficiency of the mask material. With respirators, we test the whole device, but with face masks, we're testing just the material itself. So it's a smaller test area, and it is a lower flow rate. So this test is not as strict or not as stringent as the respirator test. We're only using a 28.3 liter per minute flow rate as opposed to an 85 liter per minute flow rate. And we challenge the material for 1 minute. We're aerosolizing a Staphylococcus aureus bacteria and then pulling a vacuum and measuring the concentration of the virus before it hits the sample, and then how many of those particulates, how much of that bacteria get through the sample and impact the auger plates. The way that we collect and count the bacteria that penetrates through the material is using an Anderson sampler. Anderson samplers mimic the human lungs. So there's 6 different stages. Each stage has holes in it that get smaller and smaller as the stages go down. So it helps us to size the particles and, again, like I said, mimic the human respiratory system. So we can tell by the size of those particles how deeply it's penetrating into the lungs. The range of particles goes from 0.6 to greater than 7 microns. The test requires that our mean particle size is 2.7 to 3.3 microns in size. So the majority of the particles are going to be in that stage 4 range, which means that it's going to penetrate deep into the lungs as well. So this graphic here, we're showing the size of Staphylococcus aureus that we're using in this test. It is approximately 1,000 nanometers. So it's almost 10 times larger than the coronavirus, which is approximately 120 nanometers. Why is this bacteria sufficient to use in this test if the coronavirus or influenza virus or other viruses are so much smaller? As you can see in the picture below, as someone sneezes or coughs or speaks, it's the water droplets that are coming out of the mouth that the bacteria or the virus are attached to. There are no free-floating viruses or bacteria in the air. They're always attached to some kind of particle, whether it be a fluid or a dust or hair particle or something. And so we're not, in these tests, we're not measuring the size of the actual bacteria or the virus. We're actually testing the size of the particle that these organisms are attached to. So that's why it is appropriate. And again, these face masks are designed to protect the environment from us, from what is leaving our mouth, from our sneezes or coughs or as we speak. So if you are infected, if you have an illness, wearing a face mask will protect those around you, protect the environment, because you are not releasing those particles into the air. All right, the next test is a particle filtration efficiency. So this is different than our BFE. This uses a non-viable particle. It's a polystyrene latex sphere. The standard requires a 0.1 micron. And this test is only required here in the US by ASTM F2100 and by the FDA. Europe does not require this test. But the FDA feels that it is important that we test submicron particles as well. These particles are not neutralized. They carry a charge as opposed to the 0.3 micron particles we use in the respirator testing. So these particles are easily filtered out of the air because of the charge of the face mask material. It will attract the particles based on that charge and filter them out a little bit easier. And we are also only pulling a 28.3 liter per minute flow as opposed to the 85 liter per minute flow of the respirator. So you might think that this test is more stringent than the respirator test because of the small particle size, but it actually isn't due to the flow rate and also the charge of the particles, which helps in filtering it out. As you can see, we are testing a flat sheet as well. We will not test the full respirator, so we do require a flat sheet material when it comes to this test. All right, the next test is breathability. So similar to the respirators, we require breathability for face masks. You can see in this picture here, instead of testing the full face mask, we're just testing a portion of that mask material. The standard does require at least 5 readings. So we'll take different readings on 5 different locations on that mask material, take an average to determine how breathable and how comfortable the mask is. If it's not very breathable, people aren't going to want to wear this mask very long because it'll get hot. It gets hard to breathe. Many of you have probably been wearing masks around and know how uncomfortable they get over long periods of time. So for our healthcare workers that have to wear these through long surgeries, the more comfortable and more breathable it is, the better for them. The next aspect is synthetic blood penetration testing. This follows for the US, ASTM F1862, or in Europe, ISO 22609. This is a test that tests the outside of the mask. For the other tests for face masks, we test the inside of the face mask because it's the environment we're protecting. This test, we're actually testing the outside because during surgery, if an artery were cut and blood were to spray or splatter, if it impacts that mask, we don't want it to penetrate through. So that's what we're testing is the different pressures. We have options for a low or normal or a high blood pressure. In the US, there are 3 options, level 1, 2, and 3, based on those pressures. In Europe, they only require the middle 120 millimeters of mercury pressure. And that is, they only have 1 mask that complies with protection for synthetic blood. It's their type 2R mask. And then some of the safety testing that is required is flammability here in the US. It follows 16 CFR part 1610. It just determines how quickly the material can burn. In surgery, a lot of times you are in an environment with high concentration of oxygen and sometimes using devices that can cause fires and sparks, such as cauterizing devices or other types of devices. So to show that the material will not burn readily, is important for safety for those that are wearing it. And again, US requires this, Europe does not. And a test that Europe requires that US does not is microbial cleanliness. This is a simple bioburden test to show how much microbial bioburden is on that face mask as it's being delivered. Some ORs and surgical suites require a sterilized face mask, and so manufacturers will go through a sterilization process, but most face masks are non-sterile, but manufacturers will need to show that their manufacturing sites are clean and are not creating a high burden of microbial load on that face mask as they're being distributed. All right, here's a depiction of some of the regulatory requirements for face masks. So comparing ASTM F2100 to the European and what those requirements are based on the different level of face mask. So ASTM has level 1, 2, and 3. EN has types 1, 2, and then a type 2R that requires the synthetic blood penetration. You'll notice on the safety, it does talk about biocompatibility as a requirement. So I'm going to turn time back over to Thor to talk a little bit about some biocompatibility and how it might have changed through this EUA.
Thanks, Todd. And we're kind of going to go through this relatively quickly because most of this information here is for your information. But I do kind of want to talk about, so for biocompatibility, when you're looking at face masks, most of the face masks that we they're considered surface devices with prolonged or permanent contact. And so when you're looking at going to the FDA, there's 3 main tests or categories that you have to evaluate for these type of masks. That's cytotoxicity, sensitization, and irritation. So those are the 3 kind of categories that you have to, biological effects is what we call them, that you have to evaluate. So I put detail about these 3 tests here that are more for your information, but basically being high level, cytotox is a cellular test. It's ran on L929 cells, which are mouse fibroblast cells. These cells are put on the bottom of a plate, and the mask is either, it's extracted into this media, this cell culture media. And by extraction, I mean it's put into this fluid, put at a high temperature or body temperature, depending on the test, let it soak there for an amount of time, kind of drawing out those chemicals into the solution like a chemical soup. And then we take that solution and we put it onto the test, in this case, the cells. And so these cells then respond to whatever toxins could be in the masks. So that's the cytotoxicity test. It's very sensitive. And when we've done inside investigations within Nelson, we did a 10-year investigation where if a device failed a test for biocompatibility, 93% of the time, it was the cytotoxicity test. It happens to be the cheapest and quickest test too. So it makes it a really good screening test. It does not cover everything, so be very careful about that, but it is a very good screening test. And it does have certain scoring criteria from 0 to 4. And so these are kind of examples for you to have. The next biological endpoint is irritation. Irritation, a lot of people are familiar with irritation if you've ever had an irritation response to like a chemical or soap, things like that. But this irritation test is done in rabbits. And so we, once again, make that soup and we inject it into rabbits to look for an irritation. The next endpoint that we have to run through is called sensitization. Sensitization looks very similar to irritation. It's redness and swelling on the skin. The big difference is that irritation is an immediate response to an antigen. So as soon as you get exposed to that soap or chemical, you break out into redness and swelling. Sensitization is about repeated exposure. So the best example that you have is poison ivy. Lots of people know poison ivy. The first time you contact this plant, poison ivy, you don't break out. But you have these little cells in your body that remember what that poison ivy looks like. So the next time you touch it or the third time you touch it, you break out. It may look very similar to irritation, but it's a different biological reaction. It's more systemic too, so it's all over the body more than localized. So these are the 3 endpoints that we have to evaluate for masks, usually when you're submitting to the FDA. Under the FDA's emergency use authorization order, there has been a little bit different, and it looks like the slides aren't coming up perfectly, so I'll just talk through them. With the emergency FDA order, what the FDA has asked us to look at is they want you to do that cytotoxicity test because it's quick and cheap and sensitive. Then they want you to perform a material evaluation. That material evaluation looks at the sensitization and irritation potential of your material. So is this a material that's been used in masks before? Is it something new? Do you have a coating on it, an active pharmaceutical? You have to understand what the materials are, and you need to have somebody do an evaluation of those materials. So as soon as you do those evaluations, you understand the risks of sensitization and irritation, and you perform the cytotoxicity test. Now you have sufficient information to utilize that mask in a hospital setting under the emergency use authorization. And I think right now, as far as the last thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about where we're going now, and then we'll get to questions. I think Todd and I both have talked with multiple, like hundreds and hundreds of medical device manufacturers making masks. And I think one thing for me, as far as where we're going now, what we're learning is I think most people are looking to not have so much dependence on international supply of PPE. I think one of the big issues we've had is that because of the issues in supply, most of our supply came overseas. And we didn't really have very reliable supply of PPE here in the United States. So I think just not as a consumer of these, but also talking with FDA and other hospitals, I think we're looking for more of a reliable supply within our own country. So that's one thing that will change. And then I'm also interested to see what will happen on the day-to-day use of masks. We're seeing them used a lot now out in the stores and things like that with good reason. But I'm interested to see that once people start getting comfortable with the new norm, do masks continue to be a part of our normal attire, or does it go back to the normal? So, Todd, do you have anything on that?
So one thing with that is, I know on the standards committees like ASTM that has this requirement for medical face masks, there's been a lot of discussion recently about developing some standards, developing some things to look at general use masks for the general public, not in a healthcare facility. Standards on the standards committee, we're looking at the same thing. One thing we didn't touch on was in the EUA was decontamination or sterilization. Most of these face masks and respirators at this point are one-time use and discard. But I know there's been a lot of research, a lot of time spent on can these be disinfected, can they be sterilized and reused? And so that's another aspect that I think going forward we'll have a better approach and ability to use them more often.
Great. So Jessica, I think that's it, and is some time for some questions, I think.
Absolutely. So one, thank you guys so much for this. And actually, Todd, that was a perfect lead-in when you were talking about reuse and sterilization. So one of the questions that we have is that if a face mask is considered or is labeled as a medical device, does it need to be sterile? And if so, is there a required or preferred method?
Yes. No, there's no requirement to have it be sterile. Depending on the use, depending on where it's going to be used, how it's going to be used, and the facility it's going to be used in. So sometimes they will require it to be sterile if it's going into a particular clean room. But for most procedures, it's not necessarily required to be sterile. Each manufacturer will have to evaluate their materials of their face mask to determine what is the best method of sterilization. That's been some of the concern with the reprocessing is if it's sterilized, is that sterilization method going to change the filtration properties or the breathability of that material, or weaken the straps that are being used to tie it around the head? And so those are a lot of the aspects we're looking at. So no, it does not necessarily need to be sterile, but there are some sterile masks out there because of the need.
You had talked a little bit about from the EUA and how that changes all of this. The question comes in that this individual has not seen any EUA criteria for face masks or respirators to do cytotoxicity and material evaluation testing. Is it a requirement to get an EUA for face masks and respirators that you do those tests?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this kind of goes into where you're using your masks, and it kind of goes more to the facility that's looking. So we're getting a lot of companies like hospitals or places like that are coming to us as a lab that have tested these masks, and they're going, how do I know my nurses are getting irritant responses? How do I know I need to protect my workers too? And so we worked with the FDA to work through this evaluation where they do a cytotox and then a sensitization and irritation. So it's not something that you need to do to basically get it on the market. Like I said, right now, it would be when the emergency use is over. But we're starting to see a lot of users actually require this because we're starting to see problems with sensitization and irritation and biocompatibility of these masks with a lot more people using them and a lot longer durations.
Awesome. Okay, so we get into some standards questions now, and you mentioned, Todd, a couple of different standards and different testing. What are the differences between testing to ASTM F2101 and NIOSH certification testing?
Yeah, so those, I can't remember which slide it was. I think it might have been slide 5 or 6. I laid out what those different test requirements are. So for ASTM testing, it lists the different test requirements, and then for NIOSH, the requirements. In order to be certified, you need to perform the testing. For a surgical face mask, after the EUA, you would need to submit a 510K clearance through the FDA if it's going to be a medical device and be used in healthcare facility by healthcare professionals. And so the FDA would give it a 510K clearance to be used on the market. For a respirator, they would go, you'd have to send it into a testing lab to receive a pre-certification where we just test the filtration efficiency, breathability, and if there's a valve leak. Once it meets all the criteria, then you would submit to NIOSH. NIOSH actually does the certification. They would go through and test the product again to show on their equipment that it's performing the way that the pre-certification said it would. And then NIOSH has other criteria too. They'll do a fit test on the product to show that it can fit tightly. They'll actually inspect the facility, the manufacturing facility, look at the quality program at that facility, and do some other checks on their side before they will certify the product.
That is a great lead-in, Todd. So you actually answered some of these other questions. So the question was that you just answered: does the NIOSH lab repeat the manufacturer's test before they accept it? Do they just use the test results that you guys do? You just answered that they do their own testing, that they do look at the pre-certification tests, but that they do their own. And then there was also the question in terms of after you do your pre-certification at Nelson, how long does it take before you would receive that NIOSH certification?
Yeah, we've so they aren't abbreviating their requirements like the FDA has with the surgical masks, and they're out 3 to 6 months.
So
probably.
Last time I talked to them, they said about 6 months turnaround time, and part of their evaluation just isn't retesting. They also do an audit for their production production of the mask. So they go on site and do like a GMP kind of style audit to make sure that there's enough controls that the masks are consistent and reproducible. So there's a lot more involved than just these tests. So a lot of people we recommend is go ahead and get like an ASTM certification now. Get the mask on the market under this emergency use, start using it, selling to hospitals or whatever. But then if you want the NIOSH, go ahead and submit there and wait for it, but don't wait for that NIOSH certification to get the device out there. We need masks, right? We need other personal protective equipment. So it's great to have the N95, but there's some really good uses right now for respirators that don't have N95 still.
And the EUA also allows for, so there's other respirator standards throughout the world. The US uses the NIOSH N95 rating, but Europe uses EN149 standard. A lot of the countries have their own requirements for respirators, And then the EUA does list which respirators that have been certified in other countries we are able to import in and use immediately without having to test here. So if it's on that list and it's been certified somewhere else, during this EUA, you can use these other respirators. And then maybe if you want to get that NIOSH certification, again, yeah, go through the process, but don't sit and wait for it if it's already on that approved list.
Awesome. That is, we might have time to squeak in one last question. We are right at time, but you've already started to answer this, so I just kind of want to give you a chance to finish. So what is Nelson Labs doing, or what do you guys see the industry doing to help address the high volume of test requests and testing result delays? I mean, you already talked about being able to have masks that have passed testing in other countries to other standards. So, there's obviously things that we can do that way.
Yeah, it's quick. So here at Nelson Labs, yeah, we have seen probably 1,000% increase in testing.
Actually, it's 3,400% increase in volume.
So there's a lot of work out there. And what we've done here at Nelson Labs is we have increased our number of employees that are doing this testing, probably fivefold. So we've gone from one shift testing to testing 24/7. So we had 3 shifts that are testing around the clock. We've validated new equipment, so we've got more test apparatus able to run the tests. I know that a lot of people that have been sending tests in are a little bit frustrated because of the amount of time, but we're working, like I say, around the clock to try to get the results out as fast as possible. We are working through our backlog now, so I think we are getting down to normal turnaround times, or closer to those now, which is great. But yeah, we've done we try to do as much as we can to help increase that.
And I would say the one other thing that we've really tried to help with is the end of that getting on the market is you have a lot of people who aren't used to taking masks with data and they don't know what to do with it. So we've been also writing summary reports of all this testing to hospitals or to nursing, whoever, basically walking through the test results and then concluding on what that means. So that's a certificate that can be given to different places to help support it. So all these things we've been trying to do to help not just test, like Todd said, 24/7 increasing, but also making it so the testing means something to people who are not used to seeing these results.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much, not only for what you guys presented today and all that information, but for what Nelson Labs has done to help try to improve those turnaround times and get back to those normal expectations for it. I know it's not something that the industry expected to see quite the volume at this point in time. So we're all doing the best we can to try to keep up with this. For anybody who is looking to attend future sessions, don't forget we have our next one starting soon. You can go to virtual-summit.greenlight.guru to register and attend the next one. Copies of these recordings will be made available for you as well. Thank you, guys.